Good evening, folks. So we are going to get started here. If you have not already, please mute your microphone. That way we're not all echoing back to each other. And welcome to this evening's Tegeder talk. For those of you who don't know me, I am Murphy Ganan. I am a member of St. Francis Cabrini community, although I am currently living in Houston, Texas. Many of you will recall that these talks are held in honor of the wishes of our former pastor, Father Mike Tegeder, who before his death in 2016 said that if I have any legacy at Cabrini, I hope it is that I tried to encourage adult conversation about vital things. The Tegeder Talks working group invites speakers to address vital topics of faith and social justice, and most importantly, to encourage adult conversation and action following our enlightenment. And so just a few housekeeping things before we begin our evening. I do want to ask that we take a moment of silence to acknowledge that we are present tonight on Indigenous land. And let us pray that we learn from our past, reconcile the present, and together create a future of justice, equity, and compassion amongst all of God's creation. Amen. And now to the good stuff. Our speaker tonight is Massimo Faggioli. Mr. Faggioli is a church historian, a professor of Theology and Religious Studies at Villanova University. He is a columnist for Croix International and a contributing writer to Commonweal magazine. He is a former professor of theology and religious studies at our own University of St. Thomas, and he has spoken here at Cabrini several times. Actually, just last Sunday, he was quoted in a front page article of the Star Tribune, which was entitled, "Whose Traditions? Catholic Tensions Grow." He was quoted as saying, "It is hard to imagine what will happen to liberal Catholicism in this country, because it is not producing a new generation of clergy that can sustain it." Tonight, Massimo will speak first on the origins and foundations of Catholic social teaching, which are deeply embedded in our faith traditions. While recalling the development of these principles, Mr. Faggioli will then speak to us of the Catholic social teaching importance as a guide for us all as we live with religious and political disruptions today. And with that, I think I have spoken enough, so I am going to hand it off to you. Massimo, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much for the invitation, for this very nice introduction. I'm very happy to be here. I'm honored also because Father Mike was one of those who really made me feel at home when I was living in the Twin Cities for those 7 years. So we have kept strong ties with the Twin Cities, with the local church as well. And so it's a great pleasure to be here and to talk about this in a very particular day, because as you have followed the news of these last 24 hours, this is something that I will talk about in the second part of tonight, because it is relevant for our conversation on Catholic social teaching, Catholic social doctrine. What is happening says something on the predicament of our time and of our church also. So as you know from the structure of tonight, my remarks have been divided in two. So the first part is more historical. So what are the major moments and concepts in this tradition called Catholic social teaching? And the second part will be more actual, more on today, more on our situation. So here, the tradition in the Catholic Church on social issues is very ancient. So in some sense, it is coessential with the very being of the church. So there is no possible intellectual reflection on the social tradition that is disconnected from the real experience, which has always been the major source of inspiration for Christians. But there are some moments that have sparked some acceleration in what Catholics and have thought about what is the responsibility of us as a church, as individuals, as groups in history. And so the first major shift is in the Middle Ages. It's in the 11th, 12th century. And it's interesting because it is a whole reflection on a certain idea of justice and of rights and responsibilities that is really part of the death struggle between church and empire. And it may sound strange to us because we have identified in these last few decades canon law with the driest, the least inspiring of all sources. But actually, in the 11th, 12th century, there is an incredible treasure of ideas, of concepts of social justice that is really part of the contribution of the early canon lawyers who think about what is justice. And for them, the big problem back then was whose justice? Of the empire, of the church, of the emperor, or of the pope. And so that is what, and there's the whole controversy on poverty, what it means to be poor for the church, the condemnation of this doctrine on poverty as heretical. And so that is very far in our past. I mean, it starts 10 centuries ago. And I will not spend much time on that, but it's important because it says something that for the most part of church history, the ideas on social justice, on economic justice, on rights, they come from this clash between church and empire. Church and politics before political modernity, before the French Revolution, before the American Revolution. Okay, so that is a very big part of this history most part. Why most part? Because the most recent part begins in the 19th century, begins in historical terms yesterday or day before yesterday. I mean, very, very recently. Why is that? Well, because it starts first with the shock of the revolutions and of liberalism. This idea that political modernity was essentially anti-Christian, anti-religious, especially the French Revolution, but also the liberal revolutions of Europe in the 19th century, in Germany, Belgium, Italy, Spain, and so on. So it starts as a political struggle to understand what the church's role was going to be in this modern world, political modernity. But for the first century, more or less, between the revolutions, the French and the American Revolution, and the late 19th century, so those 100 years, the church is or looks really lost. It is really lost in this cataclysmic event where kings were guillotined, where parliaments had taken the place of bishops, and sovereigns had acquired a legitimacy that was in competition with religion, really. So for that century, the church is really lost, and there are signs of reactions. If you remember, if you have heard, I think, about Vatican I, the First Vatican Council, 1869, 1860, the declarations of papal primacy, papal infallibility, is clearly a Catholic reaction against political modernity by trying to acquire some concepts of modern political sovereignty applying to the papacy. So it is not a response that is very original in that century. Something changes with this document that all Catholics especially have heard about, which is Rerum Novarum, which is the encyclical of Pope Leo XIII, 1891, which is really the beginning of the modern Catholic social teaching or doctrine. We will see what's the difference. Because, and this is the interesting turning point, it is no longer the church in contraposition to the empire or the emperor or the church against the state, modern state or secular state. It's the church and capitalism and socialism, meaning with ideologies. It's something, it is really a shift, because it is no longer an institution that is sovereign, but it is a confrontation with a movement that has to do with economic models, behaviors, values, and lifestyle. It is more concrete. And so here, 1891, Rerum Novarum is really the beginning of a modern tradition of teaching on the church, on society, on the economy, on labor, basically, and on capitalism. Why is that important? Because it is no longer the church talking about charity or encouraging to charity, but it's about justice. That is a big shift. And so here Novarum opens a tradition, because since Novarum, almost every pope at intervals of 20, 30 years, more or less, there has been a great social encyclical. And actually, many of these titles of the encyclicals have echoed Rerum Novarum in their title, like the encyclical of Pope Pius XI in 1931, Quadragesimo Anno, which means 40 years after Rerum Novarum. And so there is a whole tradition. And so this goes until John Paul II and Pope Benedict, this the transmission of the inspiration of Rerum Novarum. So here in the 1930s, there's a different problem. It's no longer like, as for Pope Leo, the new economic model of capitalism, but it is the modern authoritarian and totalitarian state, which is political modernity gone wrong. And you see there the ambiguity of the response of the papacy, which is on the one hand trying to protect a space that is safe for religion and for the church, safe from the intrusion of these regimes of fascism, Nazism, communism, and so on. But at the same time, there is still, in the 1930s, a theocratic claim. The real model still of Pope Pius XI is that the real legitimacy on this earth is the churches and not of the state and of politics. And so there is still this idea that we fight as a church for justice and for the rights, but mostly for the rights of Catholics and for the rights of the church, not of individuals as such, as persons. That is really part of a progression of the growth and of learning of the Catholic tradition on how to deal with modernity. What's typical of those decades, I mean, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, is this coupling of a Catholic social justice drive and the condemnation of socialism, communism, which is something different from the criticism of socialism in Pope Leo in 1891, because after 1917, you have Soviet Russia, which is a very big country that is led by the Communist Party. It is really something that you don't have at the end of the 19th century. So here communism becomes really the article of faith of Catholicism in politics for half a century or more in the 20th century. And so here there is social justice, but also in terms of a warning against any inch given by Catholics to socialism and communism. That is dominant in Europe, and Western Europe, and in North America for sure. So here there is an interest in social justice, but always stopping a few steps before social justice becomes socially disruptive. This is something the papacy doesn't want to go into. Catholicism perceives itself
we just call it
as a bastion of social order. And so social justice, yes, but not if that means chaos. That's very clear. But that changes at a certain point. When? Well, because there's a whole shift around the time of the Second Vatican Council with Pope John the 23rd and Pope Paul the 6th. What's the big change there? I mean, Vatican II, you know what that is, okay? But there are some things that happen outside and in that context. So here, first, with Pope John, there is a significant shift within his own pontificate, because the encyclical Mater et Magistra of 1961 is a charter for social justice and the social work of the church in the modern world, but it's still much more cautious compared to what we see in his last encyclical, Pacem in Terris of 1963, which is not just an encyclical on peace, but it's an encyclical on rights, on the church acknowledging that there are individuals, persons that have a right to have rights in this world, even if they're not Catholic. That is a huge shift. I mean, it's the most important piece of social justice teaching in the Catholic Church in the 20th century. No question about that, because philosophically, And this comes from Pope John, who was a great admirer of Pope Pius the 11th. Here, Pope John abrogates and gets rid of that idea of a theocracy as a model for the church. In Pacem in Terris, there's no longer a theocratic model. So that is a huge, huge change. The church no longer sees everything against the criterion of our model is theocracy, where everyone is Catholic, and so on. Second, at Vatican II, the Constitution of Gaudium et Spes is a huge step forward, because Gaudium et Spes reframes the relations between church and world in terms of a dialogue and of a relationship, not of a struggle or a clash. Interestingly, Gaudium et Spes, in the original text that was voted by the bishops, had Catholic social teaching instead of doctrine. But in the final official text, which was cooked a little by the officials in the Vatican after being approved, there is Catholic social doctrine, which is much more institutional. Okay, so but that tells you something, that Vatican II understood that the Catholic social tradition was much better served in its spirit in terms of a tradition and not of a doctrine, which is in the hands of only those who are legitimate to speak for the church doctrine. Tradition teaching is more democratic, is more in the hands of all of us. Third big shift of the 60s is Paul VI, who in his encyclical Populorum Progressio 1967, he does away with one other thing that is very important. As I said, forever until Vatican II, the church was in favor of social justice, but always short of legitimizing or accepting the disruption of the social order. Paul VI, in some sense, crosses that line, because Paul VI, in that encyclical, which is the boldest of all, until Pope Francis at least, he goes as far as saying that there are systems of political and economic oppression that can justify revolutions. I'm not quoting verbatim here, but this is really the gist of which is, as you can imagine, shocking for many who had banked on the idea that the church was essentially for the conservation of social order. This is, after Paul VI, this is no longer true. And of course, after Paul VI, the church makes a few steps back on social justice for many reasons. One is that John Paul II comes from Poland. He had a very direct experience with communism. And for him, social justice can never become or come close to justifying social political revolutions that have something in common with communism. That is John Paul II's pontificate is one of the aspects of his pontificate, which is so complex and so rich for other things. On one thing, John Paul II saw very clearly was that the end of the Cold War was not the end of history, as it was widely wished by many intellectuals in the early 90s. The idea was communism has been defeated, capitalism has won, and the future of the world is of countries that will be all democratic and capitalist, and everyone will be happy. So that was, so here John Paul II cautions very clearly against this, saying capitalism has won against communism, but don't believe that we Catholics are one with capitalism. So this is incredibly interesting because it shows the impossibility to assimilate Catholicism to one political or economic doctrine. And so here John Paul II had a very, very clear vision on the problem of this hangover of that followed the Berlin Wall fall. And this speaks volumes to us, especially today, what we have seen in the last 24 hours in the Ukraine. So there is a short, and I think also short-lived attempt in the pontificate of Benedict XVI to reassimilate Catholicism within a Western social order concern. On some things, Benedict was a very, very interesting thinker. On social teaching, his main concern was not to get the church too involved in political issues, social issues, which meant for him status quo, in my opinion, in the Western order. That happens in the context of the post 9/11 world, of course, and so there's a whole, interreligious issue there. So here, I believe Pope Benedict is an interlude, is a transition to what we have seen in these last 9 years with Pope Francis. And I'm going to conclude here in the next couple of minutes. What is the greatest thing about Pope Francis? Pope Francis, I believe, can be seen as a liberal on some issues or more conservative on other issues, for sure. There's one thing that I think it's undisputable, which is this. Pope Francis has really tried to deconstruct or destroy, really, this idea that the church final destination is to be embedded in a Western capitalistic bourgeois system. That is one thing that you cannot take from him. He has been very clear on this since the very beginning, because he is a Jesuit, because he is a strange Jesuit in some sense, because he has a vision of the church which is less institutional and more as a movement. He comes from Latin America, and he's a son of the Second Vatican Council. So for him, social justice is something that he has seen and heard in a post-Vatican II language and grammar, mostly Paul VI for him. And so here, Pope Francis has really made a big step forward on some particular issues. On the one, human fraternity, of course, which is one of the great themes of the Second Vatican Council. But Vatican II was 40 years before 9/11. It has become more difficult now. On the environment, on immigration, all of that. So there are many different issues, but the big picture is this, is to question the dream of many Catholics, especially conservative Catholics, and I have to say, especially American conservative Catholics, that they had in the 1990s and the early 2000s. And the dream was the future of Catholicism will be American and conservative and integral part of the capitalistic system as it has been built according to the American model. They had bet their money that the future of the Catholic Church was going to be like that. And Pope Francis was elected, and that was a true shock for many, especially for those who were convinced that the future was going to be of a certain kind. And so you can understand the degree of shock and of anger of many Catholics or non-Catholics, but that had invested in this future of Catholicism when they saw this Jesuit from Argentina elected Pope, and then start speaking on the poor and the marginalized from day one. Basically, that's the whole focus of his pontificate. So I believe Pope Francis is a turning point in the tradition of Catholic social thought or teaching, because it means the globalization of Catholicism in the crisis of capitalistic globalization. So here, Catholicism has become much more global with Francis, exactly when globalization of finance, of commerce, and so on was unraveling, or was really hitting a very bumpy road. This is the extraordinary, interesting last few years that we have seen, and so this is what I've said so far is a little bit of history in these last few centuries. And in the next part, I'll talk about the challenges of today, what has changed, and what is really giving big issues to think about to us and our tradition when thinking about social justice, social issues. I think I should stop here if I remember the timeline correctly. And I thank you for your patience.
So, oh goodness, pardon me. I have a small dog that is sitting right next to this laptop, so it is a little bit shakier than previously. So the first question that came in was is in relation to the history that you were talking about during the first half, and you touched on the church's relationship with communism, particularly in sort of the almost reactionary move away from it with John Paul II, I believe. And one of our folks is wondering if you would speak a little bit to the church's relationship with fascism.
Oh, well, sure. So technically, fascism identifies the regime that took power in Italy between 1922-25 and was in power until the defeat of Italy in 1943-45. But generally, we can talk about, church and fascism when we talk about Nazism in Germany, Franco in Spain, and other regimes like Czechoslovakia during World War II, the Vichy regime in France during the occupation. So why was the Catholic Church pushed or convinced to see in fascism a potential ally? Well, because the immediate concern was in Italy and in Germany especially, was that fascism could defend the church from communism, which was mounting in terms of popularity, and of communist culture was really a la mode, was in fashion in Europe in the 30s. So fascism in these countries is clearly instrumental for the protection of the church from the immediate concerns. But there's also something bigger, which is also important to understand for us, what happened, for example, to American Catholic conservatism in these spheres. So fascism is not just anti-communist, but fascism is also anti-French Revolution, anti-Enlightenment, anti-modernity, basically, which meant a reaction against gender roles in the 1920s, 30s. Fascism guaranteed a conservation of the social order, of a certain idea of the family, of sexuality, that gave the church its place. Kept that voice, gave the church the possibility to have its voice heard in legislation, in education, schools, all of that. And so that was not just, in many cases was a political alliance that was based on a parliament with a certain majority and so on. In other cases, really cemented the role of the church in one particular country for a century. In Italy, fascism and the Holy See signed a concordat in 1929, which still guarantees in this country, in Italy, the Catholic Church position of state church, basically. In Germany, the concordat between Hitler and the Holy See was signed in 1933, and it has never been abrogated. It's been slightly amended in 1957, but the concordat of 1933 is still in force. So it is really a fundamental alliance which has given a lot to the church. At the same time, between World War II and Vatican II, Catholicism understands the tragic mistakes that were made. And so here Vatican II is in an implicit, largely unspoken way, a recognition of guilt for that kind of alliances. And it's the attempt to make amends on some issues. And there is the beginning of Catholicism steering away from that natural inclination of the church to be conservative, or to be reactionary, actually. That after Vatican II is no longer the default option. It is one of the options, but it's not as natural as it was before.
Thank you. All right. The next question is actually, I'm going to combine a couple of questions. I really apologize for the squeaky noises, and I know that this is being recorded, but the dog will not move. So we have had a couple of folks ask about Catholic social teaching and seminary, and sort of the changes in seminary training since John Paul II, particularly removing some of the philosophy from undergraduate studies. And sorry, I'm reading several questions at once. And I guess the connection to the pastoral aspect of studies, and just sort of, I guess, a question about the role of the church and perhaps the USCCB, for example, the bishops in how we're bringing Catholic social teaching into seminary, if we are at all, and what that role is and the effect it has on the seminarians and the folks that are coming out of these
Yes,
parts.
so it is hard to know what's going on in the seminaries, as you know, and that changes a lot from country to country, from area of the world to another one. Now, there's no question that the teaching on Catholic social doctrine or tradition in the seminaries was stronger at the time of Paul VI. And with John Paul II, it's the beginning of a wave in terms of a more devotional, more dogmatic kind of emphasis on the studies. I have to say, much more conservative, much more traditionalist in the United States than anywhere else. The United States is a unique case, really. So that's one of the problems we have in the church of today between Pope Francis' message and language and attention on the one side, and on the other side, what we think it's happening in many or most seminaries, where anecdotally it seems that concerns are very different, are much more on the liturgy, on devotions. But again, it is hard to know really how things are, because the seminary formation is still shaped by a culture of seclusion and of a monastic model of life, which is really part of the monasticization of the clergy. While, I mean, being a pastor is something different from being a monk. But in these last few centuries, these two things have been merged. And it's a model that is no longer working, I think. But that will take an enormous amount of energy, of work, and of capital. I mean, of political capital by a pope or the bishops. And from what we know of the majority of the US bishops, there's really no interest in addressing that issue. That is what I believe the situation is.
All right, thank you so much. So we are out of time for questions, and thank you for those very thorough answers. And I have been asked to sort of move us forward onto the next part of things, if you are feeling prepared and ready.
Okay. So this is
Yeah.
the second part. So a short introduction, and then I have three big points on what I think are the major issues that we as a church and a Catholic social teaching are facing in the world of today. So the introduction is this: the first and the most important step we have to make, and this is something I really have to make every time I teach Vatican II to my students, I mean, undergraduate or graduate, is to help them understand the huge gap that there is between the 1960s and today. This is really an incredible gap from all points of view, technological, political, social, intellectual generally. So here there are things that have happened in our church and in the world that were really not in any possible way forecast by Vatican II or predicted, like the massive process of secularization, the return of religions on the political stage globally. That's true for Islam, for Judaism, for Christianity. In the 60s, Christianity has very little political relevance. And then the 70s came, Iran, Reagan, and so on. I mean, that's a huge change. The end of the Cold War, that until the late 90s put identities in their place without too much questioning who's my side, why I am on this side. That was a world that was easier to organize in blocks, in parties, in fronts. There's one huge change in the sensibility that we have on race, on colonialism, which at Vatican II itself are minimally addressed. I mean, they are, but implicitly. There is really no consciousness of what it meant for Catholicism to be part of the colonial system for centuries, and now it has become really part of our ecclesial consciousness. So these are just a few examples on big shifts of things that for us now are front and center of our understanding of the church and of religion, and they were simply not there at the time of the Second Vatican Council. So when we talk about the church and the social tradition, social thought today, there are differences that are more direct in the sense that they affect the consciousness of the church as a presence in the world, active in the world. The time of the Second Vatican Council was an age of hope. Gaudium et Spes, the joys and hopes, and we live now in an age of anger, where globalization has made promises that it cannot keep for many of us. So that means anger, that means nationalism, means new forms of, racism or ethno-nationalism. It means phenomena of detachment from our political institutions, from our churches. It's a new age of seclusions and of exclusions it's a new age of walls, both between countries, but also within one same country, within our country. I mean, the gated communities, the Benedict option, the fact that what's public, it's not relevant because I can pay my way out of the service that is for the public. So this is, and most of all, it's the looming threat of the environmental crisis. So here there is a range of issues that are new or that are much more global than they were, because we know, for example, that at the Vatican II, some bishops, especially from South Africa, they brought up the issue of apartheid and of racism, but they were, I mean, their issues. This is no longer, I mean, racism is it's no longer an issue for one particular country only. And I cannot not mention here the catastrophic series of scandals of the abuse crisis that has had a huge impact on the credibility of the church, on its authority, on the very sense of the possibility of making sense of having a church, of having something like the church. This is, it has a magnitude that was simply unimaginable at the time of the Second Vatican Council. All these issues have weakened the responsiveness of the Catholic Church, its ability to speak, to be heard, and I have to say also its ability to think. There is an intellectual crisis that is no longer hidden. I believe it is there. So there is a paralysis because we have the sense that we know too much, and knowing too much maybe would not be good for us. And so in some clerical quarters, there's this idea that the more you know, the more dangerous it is for you. And so this is, I believe it is tragic, because it's not a way to, I mean, find a path in the future, I believe. So these are general, I mean, remarks on the changes between the foundational moment of the Catholic social teaching in this last century, Vatican II, and the post-Vatican II, and today. But I think there are three particular issues that I believe are emerging as central, and much more in the next future, I believe, for those who want to understand how essential and necessary the Catholic social teaching is. Whether you're Catholic or not, you should care for this, because there is, I believe, a Catholic intelligence on what's human that is valuable for all of us. It's not a confessional thing or a lobby kind of thing that we protect ours. It's more as a service. So I believe there are some issues on which Catholic social teaching is starting to become attentive to, because they will have a big place in the future. Number one is this. The Catholic social teaching, especially since Rerum Novarum, is a tradition on the dignity of work, of the workers, the the rights of workers, and so on. This is going to be, or has been disrupted already by the new discoveries, new inventions on artificial intelligence, on transhumanism, and so on. Now, I believe some naive people think that these AI or the robotics, and they could liberate the human being. I believe they have liberalized new forms of slavery and of domination that we don't see, but are new forms of slavery and of domination. So there are new forms of work that are a critical point for the church, because historically the Catholic Church has developed its thought on economic modernity, on political social modernity, starting from workers' rights. And those workers are largely no longer there, or where they used to be, or where the church could find them. I mean, once the church could find them in factories and in parishes, and then workers left parishes, but at least they were in factories. Now they're no longer in factories, or in a very different kind of place for the most part. So this is a critical point, because the church has to update its teaching, which is no longer replicable or repeatable in terms of Rerum, because work has changed. And those workers' rights must be re-understood in the context of an expendability of human workers, and the work of humans has not been liberated by machines. It has become more at the level of machines. So the temptation is to use humans more as machines, not to liberate them. That's my fear. So that's the first point. The second point is this. Historically, the Catholic social teaching develops starting from a social economic model in the 19th century, capitalism or communism, but that was a starting point to address the politics, the state, government. And that was important because government, states, countries, they had a huge power in keeping the excesses of capitalism in check. Now there's no longer a government or a state as strong as it used to be. Now it is the church or religion that is facing, basically naked, the ruthless power of the economic. So it's a massive change, because until recently, religion was dominated by church, and the political and the economic and the legislative was dominated by state or government. Both church and state have lost their dominance on religion, the church, and on the political, on the economic, social the state. That is a problem for the church, because once it was easier for the church to make its voice heard. I mean, Monsignor John Ryan had a good relationship with FDR, and that helped him create a certain kind of legislation. Now it has become much more complicated, because the whole system is no longer, the political has been displaced by the economic. And that is for the church a big problem. And third, and finally, it is this. The end of communism was not the end of history. History is back. And with history, also war is back. Now, this is important, not just because war is the ultimate defeat of social justice and so on, but it's important. Why? Because, especially in these last few decades, we had become convinced, both on the left and on the right, in the Catholic Church, that the problem was with the excesses, the hubris of capitalism in a liberal democratic system. And I still believe that there are many things that are wrong with capitalism in a liberal democratic system. We have seen in these last few years the rise of different forms of capitalism, and with different forms of political systems that have been hailed as heroes by the likes of Steve Bannon or the supporters of Donald Trump. But that is, I don't want to say nothing about that. Okay? But so here there is a huge problem for us, because especially since the time of the Second Vatican Council, Catholics engaged in social justice, Catholic social teaching, many of them said, democracy is our system, it's safe, it is settled. We should focus on the economic. We should tackle the neoliberal system, capitalists doing whatever they want, and so on. We have seen that that problem remains, but an old problem has come back to us, which is our democracy. And as you have seen in these last few years with Donald Trump, there has been a huge investment of propaganda in trying to sell that the end of democracy, of acts of the fair election and so on, was not going to be that bad, because you will benefit from this in the end. That was simply a scam in which many Catholics have fallen, I am afraid, okay? But the really tragic moment that we face is this, that we need to address, I believe, the problem of a substantial indifference or agnosticism of many Catholic leaders to the problem of democracy. If you have followed what the US bishops have said in these last couple of years on this issue, on the January 6th assault against Capitol Hill, against voting restrictions and so on, there's been total silence. That has been the most puzzling thing to me, to see for me. Because without a rule of law, without a democratic system that guarantees a certain certainty of the law, it is much harder for Catholics to fight for social justice. And this is something that I have witnessed in these last few years in shock, actually, because I could never imagine this. And so we see this happening in the Ukraine today, but it's very close to us. It hits close to home, because the unraveling of the Russian system as a democracy that almost was to a dictatorship, it's not entirely, totally different from what has happened to other democracies where Catholics are a majority or are a substantial presence in their intellectual, moral, social fabric. So we have a huge responsibility in this moment, I believe, because the crisis of our democracies is a crisis of Catholic consciousness of democracy. Without that, fighting for workers' rights or for immigration and environment will be much, much harder or impossible. So these are my 3 points for what I, in my opinion, are the 3 emerging issues today.
So we are starting to get a couple questions here. One of them, which I think actually ties into at least a lot of the discussion that was happening in my breakout room, is like, what is the relationship or between Catholic social teaching and liberation theology?
Well, there's a lot in common. There's no question that the liberation theology is a particular tradition or form in a particular time and a particular place. And there are different kinds of liberation theologies. And as we all know, the problem for the Vatican with some of them was their use of a Marxist lens to analyze society. But there's no question that all Catholic social teaching has become liberationist in some sense, because it has become accepted that there's no possible evangelization without the promotion of human dignity. And so that has become really part of our understanding of what it means to be church. Whether you are a liberation theologian or not, you have become part of the tradition, I think.
Thank you. I'm going to take a second to just read through a couple of these, and because I think there's a couple that I'm going to combine. I think one of the recurring themes in some of the questions that I'm seeing is, how do we incorporate and promote Catholic social teachings in our congregations or the way we approach the world, especially when we aren't really seeing that support from the hierarchy, and we're not seeing those teachings being passed on from the bishops down.
So, I mean, you're right. There's not much support from the hierarchy or from most of them, and so we should not wait for them. On the other hand, I believe that the kind of audience and of relationship that parishes have with their people, it is really hard to find elsewhere. So there is a really privileged space and moments and an audience that I believe is receptive to this. Now, the problem is when the Catholic social teaching becomes or is perceived as integral part of one political party platform. That becomes a problem, even if it's very clear that there is one party that now it is closer to what the Catholic social teaching teaches on some issues especially, and another one who is it's really difficult to know what it stands for, okay? But it becomes really delicate because in this situation, in this country, everything has become hyper-partisan, hyper-political. So every social teaching has a political option and consequence, no question about that. But it shouldn't be advertised as this is the church for those who vote in this way or the other way, because this is something that is counterproductive in the end. And I understand that this is incredibly complicated already enough, but there is a possibility to share some basic important teachings, texts. It's really the best kept secret of the Catholic Church, and they are so enlightening, so fascinating that it is really easier than we think, probably.
All right. Let's see. I think a lot of the comments and questions have in common the concern about young people in particular leaving the church and being sort of turned off by leadership, like by church leadership hyper focusing on specific canonical rules like around communion or legal fights or denying sexual abuse, rather than focusing on the broader sort of social and justice teachings at the heart of a lot of what we believe. And the question of, in what ways, this is sort of like a very, very broad opinion question. I'm about to ask you a big question. In what ways do you see this impacting the future of the church? Like when so many folks are leaving, and someone has straight up asked, do you see a schism in the future if things are continuing in this way?
So
big question.
I don't see a formal schism as there was in the Middle Ages with two popes and so on. But in some sense, schism is already here. I mean, because if you start dividing a church into ways of celebrating liturgy, well, that is a form of schism. So we are there already in some sense. Now, it's true that there is this phenomenon of young people leaving and so on. I believe there's a way to discourage that in an intelligent way. So here, I totally understand the disgust for a certain kind of leadership and of language coming from it and so on. Now, I would caution anyone who thinks about leaving the church and so on that, I mean, against the idea that salvation or happiness or whatever is in living. I mean, this is really part of our age. The temptation that living is the solution. Leaving the European Union, leaving the party, leaving the church, just living and being by myself. Now, there's a temptation that I see sometimes that you live in spite. And again, this is really one of the signs of our times. And there's this temptation now to think that outside of the church things are much better. At least the church lives or can live of the contribution of the communion of the saints. I mean, Gabriel Marcel, an important philosopher of the early 20th century, said, the air becomes unbreathable when we think that we are surrounded only by those who are alive. In the church, it's particularly true that we are not surrounded only by those who are alive. And Father Mike is one of those. So if we think about our church only looking at what we hear from people, from our bishops, only from those who we see, well, of course you are tempted to leave. But this is not the church. It is much, much bigger. And so this is really an uphill battle. I totally understand. As a teacher, as a theologian, as a parent, I know that very well. But there has to be a movement of resistance against the idea that leaving is the solution. And I'm not saying this to protect the church, but to protect those who leave, because often it's a great illusion that I'm leaving and I'm going to be much happier. Well, I'm not sure. So it takes a good guide, a good pastor, good examples that can be examples of happy Catholics or Catholics that struggle with their happiness or with their sadness, but in a spirit not of spite, or revenge, or of bitterness. That is complicated in our times.
Thank you. That I really, really especially appreciate what you said about. What was the quote that you said? The air becomes unbreathable if we believe that
we are surrounded only by those who are alive.
Yes, that I think that is a very beautiful and encompassing description of the church and the history that we're living with. It is a little after 9, so I am going to cut off questions. Is there anything else that you would like to say in closing?
I'm very grateful that I was able to be with you tonight, and I hope I'll see you again on Zoom or in person, hopefully in the Twin Cities. Thank you again.
Someday when we can all be together in person. Thank you so much for being here and for speaking with us this evening, and for all the wisdom you've imparted. So the Tegeder Talks working group has prepared a summary of Cabrini's social justice initiatives so that you can know what's currently happening in our church community. And yeah, we hope that tonight you've been inspired to learn more about Catholic social teachings, and to think about different ways to get involved. And thank you for coming tonight. Tegeder Talks are about vital conversations that are meant to lead to action. They're about lived faith. So with that, please act justly, love mercifully, and walk humbly with our God. Thanks all for attending.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Amen.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.